So we'll get started. I'm Devesh Kapoor. I head Asia programs at SAIS, and it's a personal pleasure like for me to welcome you all to this talk on social media and the pursuit of power. Our speaker is Dr. Hasfandiyar Mir, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford. Uh, he moved to Stanford after finishing his PhD at the University of Chicago, and his intellectual interests and his work is at the intersection of international security and comparative politics. His work has largely been on South Asia, focusing on counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, and political violence. And his research has appeared in major journals like International Security, International Studies Quarterly, and Security Studies. It's also a sort of pleasure to welcome Dr. Josh White, who will be chairing this panel and this talk. And I'll turn it over now to Josh. Josh, over to you.
Thanks, Devesh. We're delighted to have everyone here, and I'm particularly excited to have Sundar present some research in progress. We have set this up as a meeting rather than a personal webinar, so that after Sundar's presentation, we can have a discussion, which I will moderate. I think hopefully a lively discussion about his research, its implications, and future avenues of research. So be thinking of your questions along the way. I will turn it over to him now for his presentation, and after that we'll have a discussion for the remainder of the session. So over to you, Sundar.
All right. Many thanks for the intro, Josh and Devesh. I'm gonna share my screen now really quickly. All right. So really excited to be here. Thanks for the invite, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. If at some point I become inaudible or I accidentally mute myself, please let me know. Stop me, and yeah, I'll unmute myself. So the work I'm presenting today is a joint project with colleagues Tamar Mitz at Columbia University and Paul Stenland at the University of Chicago. And the three of us have been really interested in, my slide is, okay, moved. Yeah, so the three of us have been really interested in studying the politics of social media, specifically in hybrid regimes, right? So what are hybrid regimes? There's no precise definition of a typical hybrid regime, but political scientists generally agree that these regimes have institutional features of democracy, such as elections, sometimes competitive, with institutions of an autocracy, high degree of state control, or control by some permanent or powerful actor. Could be a political party, could be an autonomous military, or some other part of a state institution. And in these regimes, we started noticing that political leaders, activists, and supporters of major political actors have turned to social media a lot. So I'm thinking about cases like Pakistan, which is the context that I study in this paper, whose results I'll show later in the presentation, but also Myanmar, the Philippines, Turkey, Thailand, perhaps even Bangladesh, which is not here on the list. But and by the way, the number in the bracket is the Freedom House score for each regime, scaled from 0 to 100, where proximity to 0 indicates that politics in the given country is more authoritarian, whereas if you go closer towards 100, it suggests that that the country is a more functional democracy. So, a big question for us is, what does politics look like on social media in these kinds of contexts, given this surge in engagement with social media by prominent actors? Relatedly, how do political actors manage influence using social media? I mean, I think in a lot of these contexts, one thing that stands out is that actors don't have to engage only on the messaging content. Certainly they can focus on that and they can really sharpen their messaging, but they can also rely on other tools like misinformation, surveillance, online surveillance, offline surveillance, as well as censorship. Um, and then the offline political landscape in a lot of these regimes tends to be fairly turbulent. So we wonder, how does offline politics shape social media, as well as vice versa? So thinking about war and peace issues, terrorism, other interstate rivalries, coups. There was a coup in Myanmar, for instance, recently, and a major election. Again, a context that we study in this paper. Political scandal. How does that play out on social media? And finally, I think it's social media offers an opportunity in terms of data. Twitter, Facebook data has really exploded, become really accessible. And we wonder if that can be used to chart patterns, to measure, quantify major outcomes that capture political power. Now, to answer these questions, if you turn to the policy and popular literature, I think you find three sets of arguments. One, there is a persistent sort of narrative that social media is a battle space for influence, a domain where narratives are advanced and winners and losers emerge. It's an important insight, but this has been complicated more recently by, I think, a deluge of analysis, which frames social media as a wasteland of misinformation and polarization. These concerns have been expressed in the context of places like Brazil and India, but also events at home in the lead up to the 2016 and 2020 elections. Many people have sort of highlighted and focused a lot of spotlight on the role, on the tools of misinformation and polarization that are available specifically due to social media. And a third major frame is, I think it has emerged since the 2016 disclosures of Russia's interference in the US election, that social media is potentially an underbelly for foreign influence and sabotage. So I think these are important insights. Of course, they're not complete theoretical frameworks, but the political science literature that I'm a part of is catching up with these insights. It hasn't really internalized them, in the research yet. We have a lot of research on OECD countries, which frames social media essentially as an extension of normal politics, and then we have work on the other extreme, on politics of authoritarian states, which advances the frame that powerful states tend to square off against their citizens in places like Saudi Arabia and China. An important line of inquiry, but it's, we think that it's the, both of these inquiries are really focused on these two extreme ideal types, and they tell us remarkably little about a lot of action in the middle. We can also see this in the research in political science, which has appeared in, say, the last 15 years. This is data since 2005 on research which has been published related to politics and social media in poli-sci journals. The horizontal axis here shows plots the polity 4 score, and which indicates the regime type. Again, a more positive score indicates a democracy or more functional democracy, a more negative score indicates an authoritarian state. And as you can see, there's a lot of action on the extremes, not much going on in the middle. So given this gap, we think that we need some new theoretical ideas, frames for this middle part of the regime type, especially to understand how social media and politics interact with each other. We think that these conceptual frames of normal politics and state versus citizens really don't apply here. And instead, in a lot of these places, in a lot of these hybrid contexts, you have a combination of normal politics by an important set of actors, but that normal politics can be shaped by some set of government actors or other powerful actors who manipulate opinion and the playing field in specific directions, political playing field. And then you also have dissidents and others try to sort of escape these autonomous actors. If they engage in censorship or targeting, these resistors try to insert themselves in normal political conversations, and this dynamic can in turn play out over social media. And when it does, we believe that this results in a social media landscape with two major features. One, what you're likely to find on social media in hybrid context is a broad range of potential actors who are contending with each other. So it's not just about the electoral sphere and the actors who dot that. So it's not just about political parties and their supporters or the media. Regime actors matter. Dissidents matter. Perhaps rebels too, right? So which brings me sort of to the second major theoretical proposition of social media landscape in hybrid regimes, that there can be a diverse set of political interactions which are important and which need to be observed and understood. So you could see state and ruling party forces competing with dissidents and political parties vying for votes. But you could also have state forces trying to bolster specific political parties against other parties or elite rivals. And some political parties might also seek to undermine or augment a set of dissidents. So as a result, both cooperation and competition can emerge in the online sphere, which can mirror offline dynamics, and it can often be sort of murky and hard to observe. If we don't pay attention to it, or if we're not trying to sort of look out for it. So if you buy this framing of this kind of these distinct actors and their diverse interactions, we believe that it generates implications for what we all should be observing, tracking, and in turn trying to explain on social media. So the first dimension to focus on in hybrid contexts are social media narratives. So we must identify the major political actors online who matter, who are engaged in these political conversations. Related to that, we must identify sentiment towards major political actors, and also issues of interest that these political actors are often trying to advance. Next, we really emphasize the importance of studying political coalitions. So this for us is a major innovation offered by the theoretical frame that we are considering, that with numerous actors interacting in complex ways, the key to understanding political power on social media is to figure out who is supporting or opposing who. And so sometimes these coalitions can be pretty apparent, but in hybrid context, you may also have situations where coalitions are, secretive, tacit, or deniable. We see this in the Thai context, where the military and monarchy tend to back specific political party factions, even during normal democracy, or Iraq's party paramilitary politics also has some of these strange dynamics which can't be easily sort of observed and pointed out in the offline context. And as a result of these coalitions, what we think really matters and is important is the measurement of narratives and how they align across actors. And this has to be done, or this can be done in social media in real time. A third key category for us of implications is coordination, and coordination in terms of messaging, amplification of particular leaders, individuals, or content. Social media actors can use coordinated activity, through a number of different mechanisms. So troll armies, fake accounts, bots. There can be automated tools to boost things like retweets and shares on Twitter and Facebook, respectively. And these kinds of tools can be used in any political context, but we suspect that they are more important in environments where, say, the media is not free. State agencies or ruling parties are involved in trying to tilt the political playing field in a specific direction, and intimidation and misinformation are really rife. Okay, so this is, Devesh told me to not do a lot of theory, but I still did it. But now I want to pivot towards some empirics. We take these theoretical concepts and try to assess an important case of hybrid regime politics, which is Pakistan. And specifically, we study as part of this project the period in the lead up to the highly important and what eventually became a contentious national election in Pakistan in 2018. And for this, we end up focusing on, we try to measure political discourse and sentiment on Pakistan's political Twitter. We try to identify major online coalitions, and we also try to detect for evidence of coordinated activity and which actor the coordinated activity was trying to boost or undermine. And we're really informed by the coalition coordination framework that I introduced earlier. But before diving into the results, some empirical context. I'm sure many of you, in the audience follow the Pakistani political context, but in case not, I think it's there are three major actors. There is, of course, Imran Khan and his political party, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf. Imran Khan is now the prime minister of the country, having won a victory over the then incumbent political party of former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, and his daughter Maryam Nawaz is kind of is essentially his second in command and a major Twitter presence. And then, in addition to these two major political giants, there is the Pakistan Army, which has been a big part of Pakistani politics over the last 70 years. Pakistan has seen 4 coups, and even now the Pakistani military wields enormous power in all arenas of policy, and is also a key player in the country's domestic politics. So in terms of what happened in the 2018 election, Imran Khan and his party, of course, won a victory over the PMLN. But more significantly, in the lead up to this election, both the PTI and PMLN invested lots of energy in voter mobilization, political outreach via social media. And there was significant reporting that the playing field, the electoral playing field, was gradually tilted against the incumbent PMLN by the military in favor of the PTI. There were widespread allegations that there was an attempt to engineer a victory for the PTI. And even the election day was somewhat controversial, with the result transmission system collapsing for a few hours right after the results started coming in. In terms of Pakistan's digital environment, Freedom House quotes Pakistan as being not free, and it points out that there are information and technical tactics which are used by a number of different actors to engage in what it calls digital election interference. But that's just Freedom House, and this is just by way of context. It doesn't really color the analysis I'm about to show that we undertake as part of this project. Okay. So in order to study the lead up to this election, we collect a lot of data. So we used Twitter data that we started scraping in real time from Twitter's public APIs from June and August of 2018. So So yes, it has taken us this long to make progress on this paper, and you can, yeah. So there is that. We scraped content produced in Urdu, which is the national language of Pakistan and the language in which Pakistan's politics plays out, and English by major political actors in Pakistan, as well as millions of their followers on Twitter. So the political actors that we focus on include political parties, the military, media, civil society, and accounts of political dissidents. So this forms the base of our data collection. We call these core accounts, and then we build on that by scraping the feeds of the followers of these core accounts. Our data ends up including over 11 million tweets posted by 3 million accounts of account followers of political actors in Pakistan in this roughly 3-month time period. So that ends up being a lot of data. We're also able to identify the clusters of PTI, PML, and armies sort of major followers. And these are accounts which primarily follow core PTI, PML, and army accounts and not anyone else. And this will become important to the analysis that I'll show in a few minutes. Now, using this data, our methodology relies on 2 main approaches. First, we take what's called a dictionary-based approach to code the data. So we code the posts, the Twitter posts, for whether they included keywords associated with a particular topic or actor in both Urdu and English. So for instance, for PTI, we focus on words like Imran Khan, Tehreek-e-Insaf, or any of the other euphemisms that are used in Urdu and English that are generally associated with PTI. We also coded for topics that might be under discussion in some of the Twitter content. We try to identify discussion of corruption, economy, judiciary, foreign policy, human rights, India, and militancy. But we realize that the dictionary-based approach faces a lot of limitations. Words alone don't convey the context or convey convey sort of the subtleties of conversation. And so to overcome that, or to overcome that limitation of the dictionary approach, we rely on machine learning predictions of our content. This, I believe, is a major value add of our project. In effect, a proof of concept, as well as a unique way to assess Pakistani politics. To do this, we assembled a small team of research assistants who created a training set of 12,000 annotated tweets with the annotations for who the actor was in a given tweet, what the sentiment was towards the actor in a given tweet, and what was the topic that was being discussed. And then we used this training set to train a machine learning model, which would then predict and classify the roughly 3 million Urdu tweets that we have for actor, sentiment, and topic. Okay. So this is kind of what we did. I hope I was able to keep it simple enough and explain what we did, but we're happy to chat more on the methodology in the Q&A. But now I want to pivot towards the result. What did we find? Well, based on these methods, the first major result for us is that in terms of mentions or representation of actors, the PTI really dominated Pakistan's political Twitter. To those of you who were watching the election in real time, this may or may not be surprising. I'm not sure. It really depends on who you were following, on your feed. But what we find is that PTI comes out ahead in the dictionary-based approach. In English, as shown in panel C, it was a lot more representative. In Urdu, PMLN was competitive in the but still was behind PTI. Excuse me. In machine learning based predictions of Urdu tweets, again, PTI did well, which is the panel B. But PMLN was also competitive, it was sort of close behind. Again, please note that the machine learning classification is limited to Urdu tweets. And note that despite the reporting that military was playing a salient role in shaping the electoral process, the overall discussion on military was very, very limited compared to the discussion regarding these two other major political actors. So that's a, that was a surprising finding for us when we found it. Okay. Now, in terms of topics, based on our machine learning predictions, we find that the discourse on India, corruption, and judicial intervention were very salient. And this was, so given focus on these topics, there was less discussion on the economy, on human rights, or even militancy, which is somewhat surprising given Pakistan has seen so much violence over the last decade and more. These topics, India, judiciary, corruption, were strongly pushed by the PTI in the lead up to the election, though you could argue that judicial intervention on its own probably saw a lot of salience in the PMLN's narrative as well. So there might be a significant share of PMLN's Twitter sort of engaging in that conversation. But overall, I think it appears that corruption and judiciary were the two major domestic politics issues that dominated the discussion. Now, this next result is a big one. It's really important for us, and it focuses on sentiment on Pakistan's political Twitter. We find that in this period, in this 3-month time window, in aggregate, pro-PTI and anti-PMLN sentiment was most dominant. And opinions favorable to the PMLN were again 3rd and 4th, which were anti-PTI and pro-PMLN. Pro-PMLN sentiment was really lagged behind. And note that despite the military having been salient in playing a role in the electoral process, the overall sentiment towards the military, both favorable and unfavorable, was very, very limited compared to sentiments and opinions on PMLN and PTI. Again, that sort of shows that at least the online conversation was really about these major political actors and slash parties. Okay. So our data is can be collapsed at the level of each day. It's a dynamic real-time data collection effort. So we are able to conduct what we call is an event study to assess how major events in the months before the election mediated or corresponded with sentiments. So on this graph, you can see 5 major national level events that affected Pakistani politics. So in early June 2018, for instance, there was a censorship shock. There were some threats, as well as there was a crackdown against some dissidents by the Pakistani military, or well, I'd say unknown personnel who were affiliated with the state. There was the departure of former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif to London amid a major graft case against him based on the Panama Papers leaks. And the case was, of course, set to be pushed by the military and the Supreme Court. And then there was the verdict of that case itself in early July. Next, Nawaz Sharif returned from London with a lot of fanfare and was arrested at the airport with the PMLN out on the streets. And finally, there was the election itself. So, these were the series of interrelated events in this time window that we study. And what we see is that across these events, which were unfavorable for Nawaz Sharif and his PMLN definitely lost a lot of ground on social media. The anti-PMLN sentiment really intensified And it was only following the Panama Papers verdict in mid-July that pro-PTI sentiment, which was lower than anti-PML sentiment, began to pick up, and that sentiment, going into the election, PTI had that sentiment behind it, at least on social media, and following the election, the party was able to consolidate ground, and the pro-PMLN sentiment kind of dropped out. Okay. So now these were social media narratives, representation of actors, also shown you the movement of sentiment, aggregate sentiment as well. But as I argued earlier, the big purchase of the hybrid regime framework and the use of large M social media data is that it can allow us to measure or identify coalitions to at least an extent, even if not perfectly. And so the chart here that I put up on the slide, this is an effort to get at that coalition. And specifically, this chart maps out PTI's coalition using a network analysis. This is a retweet network of followers of the PTI, people who largely follow PTI and its leadership, and not other actors. And this is what's called, this is a mathematical object. It's called a directed graph. I'm going to try to really simplify this, but what's going on this map is that the circles and nodes are individual Twitter accounts. The lines connecting them are retweets, incoming or outgoing. The size of nodes, circles, is proportional to the number of incoming and outgoing retweets for that particular account. And the color of node, as well as the lines and edges, represent affiliation of the Twitter accounts whose legend is on the left-hand side. So, with that, the main information in this chart is that Imran Khan and the PTI's accounts, which are in green, they were the most retweeted, which is, of course, no surprise. This is the retweet network of PTI's followers. But the more interesting information is that the Army's high-profile Twitter account called Official DGISPR, that gets retweeted a lot by PTI followers. Notice the color turquoise at the top of the screen. Then parts of the media in color pink, they appear to get a lot of traction, strong traction among PTI followers. There is, for instance, the website Siyasat PK, which anecdotally we know aligns, produces a lot of content favorable to the PTI. And there is also the account of Irshad Bhatti, who's a TV talking head, famous for his pro-PTI and anti-PMLN sermons. So he gets boosted a lot in this particular network. And there's lots of other sizable media as well, which it dominates this particular network, but it's generally diffuse. Now, turning to the Army's online coalition, this is the retweet network of some of major Army accounts by the Army's followers. Obviously, the Army's high-profile Twitter account, the DGISPR account, that gets retweeted a lot. We would expect that. This is the Army's coalition after all. But it's interesting that among political parties, the party that gets retweeted more in this network is Imran Khan and his PTI. They're definitely amplified a lot, and in some ways more than not in some ways, in fact, they are amplified more than the account of the DGISPR. And we see a similar section of the media and civil society, which we previously saw in the PTI's coalition, getting amplified a lot here. So for instance, Irshad Bhatti and Anwar Lodi, by the way, was also in the PTI's coalition. All right. But now turning to the PMLN followers retweet network, this is a very different story. Here, the PMLN, of course, its leadership is very dominant. Lots of Mariam Nawaz, for example, in the top right. but then interestingly, a different section of the media, which is in the color pink, is pervasive here. So Omar Chima, who works for Pakistan's largest newspaper, The News, is active here. The TV channel Geo does really well in this particular retweet network. And there's no meaningful retweeting of the army. There's no DJ ISPR here. Also, parts of the dissident network get some traction here. For instance, Gul Bukhari, who's in the color red, is a famous dissident, and she now lives in exile in London, and clearly she gets retweeted a lot among PMLN followers. Okay, there's an interesting result on how Twitter users who mainly follow PTI, Army, PMLN, and dissidents end up tweeting content related to corruption and judiciary, which is on the panel B. And this is, I mean, there are some differences. For example, the dissidents also appear to talk a lot more about, or at least compared to the other followers, about human rights and militancy. But by and large, the topics that all of these clusters are talking about are corruption and judiciary. And as these are issues that the PTI sought to elevate, I think it's kind of a win for the PTI. They are indicative of a narrative swamping phenomena by the PTI, and it suggests to us. I mean, it's not affirmative evidence, but it strongly suggests to us that the PTI was successful in permeating and influencing the clusters of major actors, and move the conversation towards topics and ideas that it wanted discussed. Okay. Now I've shown you, sort of narrative representation, some coalition data. I want to pivot towards coordination. That's the third major piece of our framework. And there can be lots of different types of coordination on social media. Hashtag trending and in-term amplification is a major one, which has been popular in lots of places, and it has particular salience in Pakistan. There's a great Al Jazeera documentary of a famous Pakistani hashtag trender who's now been banned by the platform, which I encourage you to check out in case you haven't already seen. In addition, there can be automated bots at play as a strategy of coordination to boost specific content. There may also be human bots, so lots of humans behaving like bots, tweeting specific content or retweeting specific types of content. We focus on studying the behavior. We focus on one specific type of coordinated activity, which is behavior as part of which users tweet almost the same identical wordings. And this kind of posting of content has become popular in a number of different contexts. I think it's one of the main coordinated amplification strategies out there. It's low tech, and it can be done via volunteers, organized troll farms, even bots, automated bots. And we find that the majority of this type of coordinated activity, which existed in Pakistan's political Twitter, was pro-PTI and anti-PMLN. There was some pro-PMLN coordinated activity as well that was, again, really lagged behind, and the pro-PTI content really dominated this volume of at least this specific type of coordinated activity. Next, we try to look at the retweet network of those accounts which engage in posting, content, this type of coordinated behavior and content. And what we find is that the network underlying that looks a lot like the PTI's coalition. So they tweet a lot, retweet a lot of Imran Khan, some ISPR, and then parts of the media, which, as I showed earlier, were prevalent in the were present in the PTI's coalition. final result, after which I'm going to round off the empiric section. So to get at the question of, how much of the political Twitter activity is actually, coordinated activity, we try to assess the proportion of the coordinated sentiment in each specific sentiment. So for instance, if we have 100 pro-army tweets, how many of the tweets are actually coordinated tweets? And what we find is that the number is actually very low. First, we check how much of the regular tweeted out sentiment in each category is coordinated, which is panel A. Next, we check how much of the retweeting of each sentiment comprises of retweeted coordinated tweets, which is panel B. And in both cases, the number is small. However, it's interesting that the pro-army sentiment has the highest share of this particular type of coordination. All right. So there are more results to share, but let me conclude with by putting on table some three major takeaways that I hope I've been able to convince you on, but you should feel free to sort of challenge me and push back. First, we think that this coalition coordination framework is useful and important for understanding social media politics, especially in hybrid regimes. We believe they're a much better frame than the relatively static and harder to generalize state versus citizens or the normal politics frames that exist in the current literature. And another value add is that using this kind of large and social media data, one can measure both coalitions and coordination in real time, which reveals where political power in these dynamic and often murky context is, how it's organized. So it can be fairly informative. Relatedly, I think our concepts have validity for illiberal democracies like India and Brazil, as well as democracies which are backsliding, such as the United States. Especially the concept of coordination, it's not restricted to hybrid regimes. It's just that it might be more salient there. We think it has application for other contexts as well. In terms of a second major takeaway, I hope our empirics are informative on Pakistan's politics, providing scholars and analysts with outcomes to explain, to sort of understand better. So, for instance, PTI's coalition really dominated social media with favorable sentiment, discussion of issues it wanted to elevate. PTI and the army's follower clusters appear to offer similar narratives, and both pursued coordination activities. And the PMLN was, of course, the target of both. This is an interesting and important outcome in of itself. The question is, why do we see this outcome? And of course, I have follow Pakistani domestic politics, and I have some hypotheses. But I think other scholars, other researchers, analysts need to explain them as well. And we hope that our pattern identification will open new new lines of inquiry and new explanatory avenues and work. A final brooding point from a normative lens is that Pakistan has what appears to be a vibrant dissident sphere, which has grown over the last few years. But what we find is that by and large, the dissident sphere, was drowned out by mainstream, bigger political actors. And this finding, I think, travels beyond Pakistan. I think dissidents are important. Those who are mounting resistance against powerful regimes matter a lot, but in the face of state power and allied political actors, they often can struggle. And we believe that our focus on coalition and coordination really exposes the limits of social media as a liberation technology frame, which became popular post-Arab Spring. So there's that, and I hope this triggers some kind of normative discussion as to the value of social media for democratic development. Thank you, and open to questions now.
Terrific. Thank you, Sundar. Why don't you end your screen sharing there, and appreciate you sharing such a empirically rich set of conclusions with us. I wanted to take my prerogative to throw 3 very brief questions at you
Sure.
to begin with. You can take them quickly, and then we'll turn to those who have questions. Just raise your virtual hand, and I will call on you as we go, and we can have a discussion here for the next half hour. 3 brief questions. One of the key takeaways seems to be the effectiveness of the PTI in leveraging social media. It's, of course, it's unclear how important social media was to the election outcome, but in terms of their ability to propagate their narrative, to the sheer volume of their social media engagement was quite impressive. I mean, in some ways, this seems resonant with the conventional wisdom that the PTI was comprised of a sort of younger generation that was slightly more activist. But on the other hand, the PMLN is known to be, from an institutional frame, just a better organized party, right? A more institutionalized party that traditionally has done a great job at election-related mobilization. So maybe this, the institutionalist frame isn't what you were presenting here, but any thoughts on why it might be that the PTI was so successful in a way that an institutionalist reading might not suggest? Second, you mentioned that one of your conclusions is that the dissident sphere was drowned out. I thought that was quite interesting. I wondered if you had given any thought to including the TLP in the coding, which is arguably a dissident voice and arguably a proxy voice of the army, depending on who you ask. I know that might have been complicated by Khalid Hussein Rizvi's account getting shut down, I think in late 2018. But I think a lot of people would be interested in what the sort of correlations were between those who followed the TLP and those who followed some of the other actors you looked at. And finally, I wanted to tease out any other conclusions you had about the role of foreign policy in the Twitter discourse. I remember that our friends Nilofer Siddiqui and Chris Clary did an interesting conjoint study in which they found that there was very strong anti-India sentiment among voters, but that the effect of foreign policy on voting behavior was, in their measurement, quite small. Does that conclusion sit comfortably or uncomfortably alongside what you saw in the social media data?
Sure. Great observation, great points, Josh. So I'll take each in turn. So why was the more institutionalized PMLN, which is a party built for fighting and election, which is done well or has a history of 4 decades of doing well in elections, why did it sort of struggle in the face of the PTI's social media onslaught? Why was it not more competitive? So I think two reasons. These are more hypotheses. I think these have to be sort of looked into more deeply. One is, I think there's something to be said about the cult or like the persona of Imran Khan and the kind of enthusiasm that generates. And I think we see that enthusiasm sort of reflected on social media. So like you said, more young, more activist, and that kind of capital helps in social media mobilization. There was also the fact that the PMLN was experienced a lot of problems. There was a lot of offline messaging, in the media, which kind of pushed it back. And so the period in which it could have ramped up its social media machine, it was an uphill battle. So I think there were some, PMLN faced some major handicaps. And the final point would be that I think the PTI's social media organization might have been strengthened, reinforced by either the military or those who sort of sympathize with the military. So I think that's kind of where this coalition coordination framework comes into play. Again, hard to be affirmative with that conclusion with the data that I have, but I think it's extremely plausible that the PTI was bolstered. PTI's social media operation was bolstered in that way. The ISPR sort of played a role. So yeah, but I think your key point that why is it that the institutionalized PMLN with so much experience of contesting elections struggle. I think it's an important one, and it merits more research. On the dissident sphere, we didn't look at the TLP. In fact, TLP was not something we were focusing on when we started collecting the data, because in June 2018, it did not. Looking at Pakistan from a distance, it did not seem as salient. It was only after the election when they won the number of votes that they did, and it was that kind of shook us, that surprised us. Studying TLP's social media is hindered by the fact that it has faced, its leaders have been sort of thrown off the platform, and then they tried to reinvent themselves and open new accounts. So the TLP is harder to track, harder to pin down. Much like a lot of rebel actors. So the TTP, for instance, was at one point active on Twitter, but then it was checked out of the platform by Twitter. So that's something that, again, it's worth looking into. TLP. My sense is that TLP did better on YouTube than it did on Twitter. So there's that. Finally, role of foreign policy. I think the Clary Siddiqui finding. We were very comfortable with that. This election had India content, but the India content was more pervasive in English tweets than in Urdu tweets. In Urdu tweets, the issues that were more dominant were like pure domestic politics, judiciary, and corruption. This was an election about corruption and judicial interventions, and there were narratives on both sides, which were which both sides tried to compete with, and India was used as a slur in some cases, but it was really not something that defined the election, or not a major issue that the electorate, or at least the social media electorate, appeared to sort of care about. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to a question by Devesh Kapoor, and then we have some others lined up, Colin, Khalid, and Atif. Others, go ahead and raise your hands. But over to Devesh for the next question.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Sandhya. That was a fascinating talk about a subject I know very little about. So a few questions and observations. One is, if you can tell us a little bit about the Twitter sphere in Pakistan. So one study I saw, and I don't have any basis to prove or disprove it, is that less than 1% of the US population really is on Twitter in any active way. So here, we know that things like Twitter, there are what we call hyper users, Then there is a rapidly declining tail of people who very occasionally use it, and then a large number who just, right? So in a sense, is this action, so to speak, among 1% of the population, 5% of the population? If you can give us a sense of that. The second is that when we think about, let's say, the broad field of political communication, right? Used to be radio, print was a more elite because of lack of literacy. That has spread. Then, of course, the advent of television, and now, of course, things like social media. Where would you put social media in this relative to other forms of political communication. So, for instance, you could argue that, the New York Times, I don't know, the readership is a really tiny fraction of the US population, but arguably its influence is much larger than what its share of readership in the US population. Maybe in the past, Dawn had a much larger influence than its actual readership among a certain elite. And to the extent elites then mold public opinion, the amplification might occur not through the numbers, but who reads, who tweets, as opposed to the absolute, right? Uh, and so, like for instance, your observation about that you see India coming up much more in English tweets, but much less in the Urdu tweets. That's part of this literature that foreign policy is about elite politics, whereas it's not about mass politics.
Mm.
Whereas you would imagine mass politics being more in Urdu, elite politics being more in English, and hence for foreign policy.
Mm.
Some questions and observations that might help us understand putting your fascinating research in these bigger, broader questions.
Sure. No, really important point. So I think both your observations are related, but let me try to sort of address, more specifically, what is Twitter's penetration in Pakistan? So I'm doing a separate study with Nilofer Siddiqui at State University of New York, Albany, on misinformation in Pakistan. And as part of this study, we recently got the results back. We asked, what are the platforms that you're on? It's a nationwide survey represented, supposed to be representative of the country's population. We find that Facebook is used by, or at least 60% of the respondents, around 60% said Facebook. A number slightly smaller than that said WhatsApp. Then there was TikTok. TikTok was 30% or something like that. And then the fourth was Twitter. So to your point about 1% of the population in the US, it's not 1%. It's more than that in the Pakistani context, but it is a less used medium. It's not the most sort of prevalent, pervasive medium. But then that gets to your second point as to like who uses it and the relative salience that Twitter enjoys as a medium of political communication. So as part of my slides, I showed you the Twitter accounts of Imran Khan, the army, and Maryam Nawaz Sharif. Now these actors view Twitter as an extremely important medium by which they need to get their word out, by which they need to engage, right? By which they need to sort of mobilize and shape the opinion and the narrative. And the fact that these powerful actors, these giants of Pakistani politics, place so much emphasis on this particular medium, on messaging via this medium, I think gives the medium the salience, right? So it's it's similar to your framing, your mention of New York Times. The fact that the elite views New York Times or messaging via New York Times as as an important mode of political communication. But what are the mechanisms by which these narratives sort of play out? What's the link between the online sphere and the offline sphere? I think, again, we've started thinking about it, but we don't have good theory, good story. There is sort of the elite to elite communication channel mechanism, right? That potentially the narratives that are put out on social media inform major elites in the country, which in turn affects the public opinion, broader public opinion. I think that's a plausible channel. It's also possible that Twitter ends up seeding opinions across key nodes within the population. So not just elites, sort of key brokers across the country, take opinions off social media and then they disseminate it. So So, we don't have an answer to this question, but these are important points, and we hope that this line of inquiry that we are initiating in the South Asian context and Pakistani context would trigger inquiry into the very observations that you've made.
Thank you. Colin Cookman.
Can you hear me?
You can hear now.
Sorry. Okay. So I just had a question in terms of the sort of the audience side of this. I think one feature that's discussed in the U.S. political context is the degree to which social media sort of creates these information bubbles, perhaps contributes to nationalization of politics here, polarization of politics here. And I'm wondering, I mean, in Pakistan, you have, clearly cases every election cycle where candidates are switching party brands, perhaps as a, part of the coalition dynamics that you discussed earlier. I'm just wondering to what degree in this data you see or you think there could be ways of looking at basically the degree to which these social media networks are solidifying actual partisan IDs, at least amongst the users at the elite level. If there's maybe a way to look at what happens when people exit from one network to join another, does that happen? Is basically everybody locked in, and what implications that might have for the next round of coalition reformation?
Yeah. Important point. We've spent some time thinking about bubbles, and we actually call them clusters. So follower clusters, what's happening within them? Are they talking about completely different things? And then each cluster kind of firms up on its own sort of set of preferences, which then harden over time, and those people kind of are difficult to dislodge. We actually find that you don't have these hard bubbles, or like to the extent these bubbles exist, there is a relative asymmetry. So the PTI's bubble, of course, is massive and is hard to dislodge, and people as were part of this bubble, feel strongly a lot about these issues. But then you see that the PMLN's bubble is not as sturdy, and the PTI is sort of able to permeate that bubble with its own set of issues, narratives, and we find some evidence to suggest that. We also find that the dissidents sort of cluster, or the people who follow dissidents, they end up talking a lot about issues that the PTI is talking about, as opposed to talking about issues that they care about more. So I think this the idea of competitive bubbles is an important one, but it needs slight tweaks. It can be more dynamic, and it can also be sort of reflective of the distribution of political power. But the second part of your question, what about these elites who exit specific networks? So there were people who exited, for instance, or like left the PMLN to join the PTI. Like, what happens to them, or what happens to their set of followers? That's an interesting line of inquiry, and that's something that we could potentially investigate. Yeah, that's a good idea. So I'll be bringing this up with Paul and Tamar. We might try to look at it.
Thanks. We have a question by Atif Ahmed, and then I would also ask you to address part of the question that Farhad Siddiqui asked in the comment, which relates to geotagging or any any efforts you made to sort of geographically segment or analyze the tweets, and then I might have one final question to wrap us up. But over to Atif, and then you can address Farhan's question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor White. Asfandiar, it was a great presentation, so thank you. Learned a lot. My question would be, and I don't know if you researched this, but did you find a sort of more bots or something with English language tweets going one way or the other? Because, growing up in Bangladesh and kind of seeing, English isn't really prevalent in Bangladesh. And so tweets really, if they're doing one thing, you can tell like there's something going on. So I was wondering if you can posit that in Pakistan and you see some sort of like English language tweets which are pushing a certain agenda one way or the other.
Yeah. So bots, the sort of really important type of coordination. And so the underlying distribution of our data is that we have 11 million tweets. 3 million is our Urdu tweets, and then 8 million are the English tweets. And the English tweets are also like, a lot of them are appear to be from like overseas Pakistanis, for instance. That's a pretty, it's a, the diaspora is very vibrant and very engaged on social media. And there are, of course, non-Pakistanis as well who are engaged in these conversations, who also tweet in English. And then, so as a result of that, perhaps we have, more coordinated activity or, more of this bot-like behavior in the English tweets than in Urdu tweets. But that's not to say that the coordinated behavior in any way is sort of more limited. It's just there is a differential which tracks the differential of our or the language distribution of our data. So I hope I addressed your question.
Thank you.
And Farhan's question.
Yeah, this is about geographical distribution or geotagging.
Yeah. So let me take the first one. Why is the PPP not included in our coding? So the PPP is part of the data set. So PPPs, political leaders, followers. We definitely studied them. It's just that in the lead up to the election, PPP was not being touted as like a national level player. It was sort of scaled back to Sindh, and so we ended up focusing. We wanted to focus on the national level snapshot. But PPP is very much a part of our data set. Bilawal, Asif Rizai, I think he also has a Twitter account. His followers, their followers, and we find, I did a keyword-based search, and there is distribution. There is some PPP specific content representation, but it's more from, of course, where we would expect it from Sindh, and not from the rest of the country. So on the geographic bias question, so I think it's not so much bias as it is just the underlying distribution or nature or the penetration of social media, right? So we reflect the bias of where social media is at, right? So if social media is being used mostly in northern Punjab, I think our data collection is going to capture only that. So I think we have that limitation, or that's a major caveat on the data. We tried to assess some geographic level heterogeneity, but another sort of limitation is that a lot of users do not identify their location. So some do, but many don't, and that limits our ability to make, to offer any hard geography-specific inferences, which is why I did not present those results, but. There's some ongoing work in computer science and machine learning trying to determine locations of users who have not revealed their location. And the prediction of these algorithms is only good at the level of, I'd say, national units, maybe sometimes major subnational units like provinces. And these algorithms study network connections of users to predict the location of each user. And we tried using that on our data, but it didn't really work out. The Pakistani context is different from the European context on which some of these algorithms have been written. But more research is coming out, and maybe we can sort of move in that direction.
That's great. Let me just move on to a final question, if I might, to cap this off. It struck me that one of the big questions about this election in 2018, and in fact, it's a question that is relevant for a lot of Pakistani elections, is whether the military supported a particular candidate. In this case, did the military put its weight behind Imran Khan? And there's a widespread presumption that it did, but I wanted to know if you, not necessarily if you had the data to be able to shed light on that, but if you had the sort of, even a mental model to help us think about what that would look like in the data. Is it ISPR retweeting the PTI's tweets more than other tweets? Is it ISPR or ISPR's followers retweeting PTI? How do you show a sort of, or how would you show a kind of causal example of the military propagating its influence on Twitter in support of a particular party? And then as a secondary question, would you have the data to be able to tease that out?
Yeah, so I think the coalition chart is a metric for that, is a data point for that. The fact that the ISPR's followers were channeling the PTI's sort of narrative content, I think that to us indicates that there was something tacit going on, because the ISPR's followers, it's our understanding that they take cue from the top elite in question, which is the chief of the ISPR or the chief of the army. And our sense is that if not for that cue, if not for that sort of direction, these followers would have gone in a different direction. They could have also been, somewhat more neutral or, more evenly distributed across the two major political coalitions, the PTI and the PMLN. But we don't see any even distribution. It's, very clearly stacked in one direction. So again, that's not evidence of any sort of that's not hard evidence of electoral interference per se, but it does indicate to us that there was an alignment, a fairly robust alignment, which was in favor of the PTI and against the PMLN. And so looking at the next election, I'd say we're trying to sort of make a judgment as to, who is the military backing. I think a similar coalition analysis in real time might reveal insights as to the military sort of political position, its preferred candidate.
And as I recall, in those coalition charts, those graphs were bidirectional tweets. So I mean, the question is, how do you know that it's not simply that the PTI prefers the military, but that it's the military prefers the PTI, and the sort of the influence flows, or the information flows, the messaging flows from one to the other? That might be an interesting question to try to hone for future analysis of elections.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah. I mean, I think that could be sort of, we can slice, we can make it more, we could make it unidirectional, and try to sort of get at that point as well. Yeah.
Great. We're out of time, but thank you, Asfandir, for sharing this work in progress. It's fascinating, a huge amount of work, and I think it really gives all of us who watch the social media space in Pakistan and elsewhere more to think about as we watch what comes across our Twitter feed, and I'm looking forward to seeing where this group effort takes you. So thank you again for joining us and for joining us virtually at SAIS today.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the questions. Thanks, Avish.
Yeah.
Bye.
Take care.
Thanks, Josh.